in Shia Ismaili Islam, because the Imam is present and living on earth amongst mankind, the role of the Imam is very critical. So we have to speak a little bit then about, well, what is the role of the Imam? So as we mentioned before, for Shia Muslims, the Imam is the divinely appointed successor to the authority of the Prophet Muhammad, right? And, Shia based that on the statement which we learnt about in class, where the Prophet said, he whose Mawla I am, Ali is his Mawla. And of course, Sunni interpret it one way and the Shia interpret it another way. And the way the Shia interpret it is that they understand this statement based on this verse of the Quran. Right? The Prophet has more authority, awla, over the believers than their own souls. And they look at the statement about Ali as Mawla in that light. So whatever relationship that the Prophet had with his believers, the Shia believe that Ali has the same relationship. That's why he's the successor of Muhammad. And the other thing I would point out is look at the word usage. You have awla here and you have Mawla here, right? Those words are from like the same root in Arabic. They are related words. So thus, after Prophet Muhammad's departure from the world, the Imam is the supreme authority. Right? Now, think about it, if the Imam is present and living, then the group that recognizes this Imam, will absolutely submit to his authority. Right? If an Imam is not present, then things are sort of different. So it's important to keep that in mind. So, for example, when the Shia interpret the Quran and they look at a verse like this, obey God and obey the messenger and the possessors of authority, they understand the possessors of authority to be none other than the Imams, right? The Imam's authority is actually seen as on par with the authority of the messenger of God. And it's evident from this verse because you notice that one separate command is used for God, and one command is used for both the messenger and the possessors of authority. So Shia Islam understands that to be the authority of the Imams. And we mentioned before, the imamate continues in a single line of descent. So what happens exactly is that each imam designates one of his descendants, usually one of his sons, to be the next imam. That designation is called nas, right? So each imam appoints the next imam. It's not just, oh, I'm the firstborn, I get to be the imam, that sort of thing, right? So there's a designation. So this is different from a monarchy, in a sense. And the designation is believed to be divinely inspired. Right? So as the Shia understand it, it is God who appoints each imam. And the prototype for this is Muhammad's statement, right? The Shia understand the statement about Mawla to be a divinely inspired statement, and thus every imam appoints his successor according to the same principle. And I guess on this slide, the last thing I'd like to point out is the notion of hereditary authority is not foreign to the Islamic perspective. Right? The notion of authority in a single lineage is actually very much Quranic. Right? It's a certain model of leadership. And you find it evoked in many places in the Quran. There's actually with regards to prophets and the families of prophets, there's over 100 verses that speak to the special status of the families of prophets. This is one such verse which traces divine selection through the lineage of Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Imran, and it mentions the word dhurriya, offspring. Right? So the notion of hereditary authority is there. This verse is a bit more specific. The last one here, where God appoints Abraham as an imam, and when Shia read that, they think, well, this is talking about the imamah, right? Because we have to remember that the Prophet Muhammad, Hazrat Ali are also descendants of Abraham. So all the descendants of them are also descendants of Abraham, right? And finally, one very important verse, and Sunnis recognize the importance of this too, is about the group known as the Ahl al-Bayt, the family of the Prophet, right? And Shia Muslims, of course, understand the family of the Prophet to be Muhammad, Ali, Hassan, Hussein, Fatima, as well as all the imams that descend through that line. Right? So just to point out, the whole idea here that the notion of familial authority and familial reverence is not foreign to the Quranic perspective. Of course, it has been subject to many different interpretations over time. So continuing then, practically speaking, what does the Imam do? Especially in contemporary Shia Ismaili Islam. It's a big question. You'll find when you meet an Ismaili, you'll find that their whole understanding of faith revolves around their Imam. So the best way to answer that is to simply point out that the Imamate today continues the religious, spiritual, and even intercessory functions of the Prophet. And we find those functions actually laid out for us in the Quran. So I'm just going to list some of them here. We're not going to go through the verses in detail. But these are some of the functions that Muhammad himself did in his own time. And the Donner article that is part of our supplementary reading actually talks about some of these. So the Imam today continues to perform all these things. I'll give you an example. When the Imam meets with his Ismaili murids, the first thing the Imam says, and I paraphrase, but he basically says that he gives everyone his best loving blessings. That's the first thing that the Imam does upon meeting his murids. And that, of course, is important because you find one of the functions of the Prophet in the Quran is to send blessings over the believers. So that's just one example. All these things are present in the contemporary function of the Imam. And one may ask, well, what's the logic behind that? How does that work? Why can the Imam do these things? So in Shia Islam, as well as in Sufi Islam, there is this mystical idea that the Prophet Muhammad was the bearer of light. This light is called the light of Muhammad, or the Muhammadan reality. It is a light that God created before the creation of things. So the different prophets were carriers of this light. And in Shia Islam, the Imam continues to hold that light after the Prophet. So as Sayyid Hussein Nasr writes in this book, there's a prophetic light which has existed since the beginning within the being of every prophet from Adam onwards. It is the source of all prophetic knowledge and is identified with the Muhammadan light or Muhammadan reality, which is the Logos. It is this light that continues from one cycle of prophecy to another, and it is this light that exists within the Imam, by virtue of whose presence he becomes the Imam. So in Shia belief then, the Imam can do all this because he is the bearer of the light of Muhammad. Right? And this is commented whether you're an Ismaili Shia or whether you're a 12er Shia. Now, practically speaking, what are the impacts of the role of the Imam? So firstly, the Imam for Shia Ismailis is the interpreter of the Sharia. He contextualizes the Sharia, which means he can actually make adjustments to the religious law as based on his authority, and that includes prescribing religious practices. So for example, you find that in the Quran, prayer is mentioned, zakah is mentioned, but the Quran provides no details on how these things are done. It was actually the Prophet Muhammad who prescribed the actual form of these practices. Based on that idea, the Imam today also prescribes the form of religious practices for the Ismaili Muslims, right? And that means certain forms can be modified or changed because the essence remains the same. It's just the form that changes. And the previous Imam of the Ismailis, he wrote publicly to the whole Muslim world that it should not be forgotten that it is not the forms of prayer and fasting that have been commanded, but the facts. And we are entitled to adjust the forms to the facts of life as circumstances changed. It is the same prophet who advises his followers to ever remain ibn al-waqt, which means the children of the time and period in which they were on earth. And it must be the natural ambition of every Muslim to practice and represent his faith according to the standard of the waqt, or space-time. Which is to say, religious practices and implementation of the Sharia must evolve as circumstances evolve, and it is the role of the Imam to do that. The role of the Imam also extends to spirituality and mysticism. And in this sense, the Ismaili Imam has a similar function to that of the Sufi sheikhs or peers. So in this sense, the Imam, in addition to his first mandate, also initiates the Ismaili Muslims of that capacity into the spiritual meaning of Islam. Right? Then that's a whole other topic altogether. Now, other traditions have this too. In Twelver Shi'ism, there's a tradition called Irfan. Right? In the Sunni world, it's generally known as Sufism. So every religion has this sort of esoteric tradition, and the function of the Ismaili Imamate also includes that. So today, the present Imam of the Ismaili Muslims is known as the Aga Khan. This is the fourth Imam to bear the title of Aga Khan. He's the 49th Imam. His actual name is Imam Shah Karim al-Husayni. Right? So the thing to remember is that the present Imam is the Aga Khan. Right? That's what we write in our notes. His grandfather, who was the 48th Imam, was very famous in the international scene, serving as the president of the League of Nations in the late 1930s. Right? So that's something important to note. The present Imam is the founder and chairman of the Aga Khan Development Network. This is a private development network that aims to improve the quality of life in all facets of human life. Right? And I'll give you an example. Up the road on Winford Drive and DVP, there is an Aga Khan museum and park being opened, and the AKDN is behind that. The thing to remember is that this is not being done for fun, right? This is not being done as side philanthropy. The Aga Khan Development Network is understood to be part of the very mandate of the Ismaili Imamate. That mandate requires the Imam to translate the ethics of Islam into institutional action, into real human life. Because the Imam, even in all of Islam, the Imam's role is not just for spiritual well-being, it's for the entire well-being of those who follow him. Whether you're a Sunni Imam or a Shia Imam, right? The Imam is responsible for the care and welfare of his followers. So the AKDN is part of that, although the AKDN projects extend to parts of the world, many parts of the world where there are no Ismailis. Right? So the work itself is non-denominational. It extends everywhere. And this present Imam of the Ismailis has very much emphasized Islam as a thinking intellectual faith, right? A faith about human dignity, a faith that values tolerance. So knowledge and intellect is very, very important in Shia Islam in general and in Ismaili Islam in particular. And I'll just quote for you one of the interviews of the Aga Khan, where he said, of the Abrahamic faiths, Islam is probably the one that places the greatest emphasis on knowledge. The purpose is to understand God's creation, and therefore it is a faith which is eminently logical. Islam is a faith of reason. Now, for some context, these comments came right after the Catholic Pope made some rather controversial remarks about Islam not being based on reason. So after the Pope made those remarks, the Ismaili Imam basically came back and said, well, look, it is a faith of reason, right? So knowledge and intellect is very important.